Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Areva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, and America's advocate. Live from Los Angeles, this is The Special Report.
Welcome to our viewers in the U.S. and around the world. Today is Juneteenth, also known as Freedom, Liberation, and Jubilee Day. On the 19th of each year, 49 states commemorate a Union Army general's reading of federal orders in Galveston, Texas, proclaiming that all slaves in Texas were free. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation had formally freed slaves 2.5 years earlier. However, news of the proclamation did not spread to many southern states. It's important to note this date does not mark the end of slavery in the United States. Slavery did not officially end until December 6, 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And despite Donald Trump's ignorant and narcissistic claim, he did not make Juneteenth famous. African Americans across the country have been celebrating this day for decades, and today is no different. There are celebrations happening all over the country. And on our Juneteenth edition of the Special Report, we are continuing our conversation about race. We're delving into cancel culture. You've heard of a TV show getting canceled, but it can happen to movies, celebrities, and even company logos. Basically, if anyone does something or stands for something that is deemed bad, racist, or sexist, a social media movement can be the beginning of the end for you, and you can be, well, canceled. Meet my Hot Topics panel here to help us make sense of cancel culture. Joining me is John Murray. He's a pop culture expert and TV host, and John Thomas, a political strategist and commentator. Welcome, John and John.
My pleasure. Good to see you, Areva.
Good to be here.
Thank you guys so much for coming on today. We're going to have a lot
Happy
of fun with this.
Juneteenth, by the way. Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you. Same to you, John. Let's get at it. So everyone has an opinion about Aunt Jemima. So in doing my research for today's show, I came across a book called Slave in a Box by M.M. Manning. Yes, there is actually a book called Slave in a Box. And there's a passage in the book which says, and I quote, Aunt Jemima brand tapped into a nostalgic 1920s perception of the South as a culture of white leisure and Black labor. Aunt Jemima's ready-mix products offered middle-class white housewives the next best thing to a Black servant, a slave in a box that conjured up images of not only the food, but also the social hierarchy of the plantation South. So what say you, John Murray? Should Aunt Jemima be canceled?
You know, in the general sense of things, Areva, I'm not into cancel culture at all. I don't like bandwagon mentality. I believe in understanding the context and the intention of a thing. But the intention of these brands and Aunt Jemima and the similar brands is that a lot of them do have roots, and not just racism, but a lot of their images and a lot of the design mechanisms, even though they've evolved throughout the years, they still have Confederate roots as well. And so anything that speaks to the torture, the terror, the bad times, the overcoming, the emancipation that our ancestors had to go to, those images should have evolved decades ago. And so, we're in this time of reckoning for Black Americans. And, there was a time when we, folks like you and I be on television saying, people of color, but no, people of color have stood with every other marginalized group while they have overcome, while still trying to overcome ourselves. So this is Black Americans' day of reckoning. We're having our season of Me Too. And as we are overcoming the images that we have to face on a daily basis, whether we're cooking, whether we're walking in buildings, all of these things, they've got to go. And so I acknowledge and recognize these brands for finally having the epiphany that they've made a lot of money off of racist rhetoric and racist images and racist history. And I champion them to see what's going to be next and how these images evolve.
All right, John Thomas, what do you think? Is Aunt Jemima a brand that should be retired, or is this a lot to do about nothing?
Well, I think the company's made a lot of money off of a damn good pancake syrup is what they've made money on, not necessarily trading on racism. I grew up with that brand because it was the sweetest of all the syrups. And it came in a really fun bottle versus a log cabin or something that was just your lick 'em stick 'em bottle. I know when I grew up, to us, it didn't have any racist connotation. But look, it's a private company. If they want to change it, good for them. That's their call. What I think that we have to be careful of is larger as a society, letting a vocal mob on Twitter cause you to change your identity, fire people, or tear down statues like George Washington, or some schools are canceling the annual George Washington dinner. And it just, at what point does it go too far? And then the question is, do we replace it with what? And is that ever going to stand the test of time? So I think you have to be careful to draw a line and not necessarily given to the Twitter mob. And by the way, this is a standard tactic that's been used with cable news hosts and others that the mob doesn't like. You attack the advertisers, hurt them in the pocketbook, and hope to get the corporation to make a change.
So, John, you raise an interesting point about the mob, the Twitter mob, and we've seen it happen, not just with brands, we've seen it happen with individuals. You mentioned cable news hosts, but it's been celebrities and just everyday people. And John Murray, I want to say to you, I hear your point, but did you know that the great-grandson of Aunt Jemima doesn't want Quaker Foods to retire the logo? He says this is actually an injustice for him and his family. His name is Larnell Evans Sr., and he says if they do away with this logo, it's going to erase this part of his family's history. So what would you say to Mr. Evans, who says, don't change this because this is our family history?
Well, with all due respect to Mr. Evans' grandmother was not the originator of the Aunt Jemima logo. The original Aunt Jemima was an actual slave who was dressed up and sent around to present these pancakes and these syrups for white people all throughout Chicago and other parts of the Midwest. And so his grandmother actually was second. So he also has a very complicated history with the brand because he sued them for some financial benefits, represented himself in court, lost the case, and it was dismissed with prejudice. So, his view on this isn't one that I'm taking seriously. And if he would like to honor both the original Aunt Jemima and his great grandmother who took it over, he can make a trip to Washington, D.C. to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, where I'm sure they'll have an exhibit on this story. But there's something I also want to say about what John Thomas said. Black people fighting for social justice and Black people fighting to overcome the inequalities that we face on a daily basis. Black mothers like you, Ariva, and like mine, who have to have anxiety every time their children leave the house because they're afraid they're going to be killed by cops. And then some are killed by cops like George Floyd was on. Those aren't, that's not a mob, and that's not a Twitter mob. And so Black people having our moment of overcoming, I don't want it referred to as a mob. That's offensive to me, particularly on Juneteenth, and we need to be careful about the language we use here. I know that's very much from the Fox News playbook, but if we're going to have a very enlightened, educational, and uplifting conversation today from a smart aspect, then we have to be careful about the language that we use.
Well, yeah, John, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but what I'm trying to make a broader point is we just have to be careful not to let it run amok. And I'm not saying that if Aunt Jemima's company wanted to change that, that's their call. It may be appropriate if they find to do so. But at what point do we, when we're tearing down statues of George Washington, what point do we draw a line and say he wasn't perfect, but the slavery aspect does not define George Washington's contribution to history?
But it does to me because.
But hold on. I just want to step in again, John. John Thomas, I want to go back to something you said. You keep saying if the company wants to take the logo off, you're fine with that. But I think what John Murray is saying, we need you to be more than fine with the company taking the logo off. How come you can't just stand up and acknowledge what John Murray is saying, which is that this is a part of a terrorist history. It's a part of a very negative history for African Americans. It's offensive to African Americans, and categorically, unequivocally, yes, this logo should be retired. Can you say
because
that?
it's not my property. It's not my company. So I don't want to mandate.
You-
I don't
you're
want to
a
mandate to
commentator.
them to do
Wait,
something.
wait,
Your
John Thomas.
ancestors were my ancestors were
John,
your
hold on,
family
hold on.
property. So that
John
that's
Thomas,
why this is
you,
problematic.
you are a commentator on national television. You have opinions about everything, and I've been there with you, brother.
Right,
so you
right,
know
right.
know
I
you
just
have
share. I
opinions.
just shared my opinion. If the company chooses to make that decision, I fully support that. That's their decision. You're
John
just
Murray,
wanting me.
Go ahead and tell John Thomas why that's
John, the
such
problem
a
here is that you want me to acknowledge the history that you've been told about George Washington, but you don't want to acknowledge the history that my ancestors suffered. So it's okay for you to have some
I'm not,
syrup,
John. I'm not
because-
disagreeing at all with the
but the
facts
problem
as
is
you
talking
laid
about
it out.
corporations
Okay,
and
guys, you
images
can't
and
both
property.
talk over each other because no one will hear you.
You're talking about corporations and images and property in which you're not a part of. But the reality is that my ancestors were the property of yours. And what we're saying is there's so
They
much
weren't
of what's happening here in America is still rooted in that racism. And America has never atoned for its greatest sin, which is racism. And now Black people are finally standing up and saying enough is enough. We've helped everybody else overcome. We've built the infrastructure of this country. The White House, where the most racist man I've seen in my lifetime lives, my ancestors built. And now we're finally having our day of reckoning. And if you can't acknowledge that that's a part of America's history, then that's part of the problem and why we're here. That's why the rioting and the protesting and all the things are happening in America, because people are trying to get your attention.
I think we're talking on separate planes. You're saying that because I don't demand that a private company take action, a private company that I don't control, that somehow I'm not acknowledging history. I'm completely
saying you're
comfortable
not
and willing to
empathetic
acknowledge history.
I'm
I'm
not
just telling you
asking
that I don't think it. I don't think it's my right to tell a private company what they can and can't do.
John Thomas, what are you willing to acknowledge? We know you don't control the private company. We already know that. That's a given.
I'm willing to acknowledge the roots of Aunt Jemima. I get it. I mean, I understand that. I'm not disagreeing that was the roots, but it's a question of should we, of something that doesn't exist today. I don't know that anybody in that company is racist. I don't think that they use the imagery to push out racist things. That's their call. If they want to change it, that's their call.
Okay,
I'm not denying the history. I don't know how we're conflating.
I just want to note that it's not just Aunt Jemima. It's also the company that makes Uncle Ben's rice. It's the company that makes cream of wheat. So lots of companies are having these conversations about, their use of these logos that conjure up these negative images, these stereotypical images, these harmful and hateful images of, our really ugly past with racism and slavery in this country. And John Thomas, I think you did make an acknowledgement. I want both of you to know that I did a survey on my Instagram page, and 76% said the brand should change its logo. Only 24% said that the logo should remain. And then comedian Camu Bell weighed in. He tweeted that the conversation about logos may cause us to lose sight of what we're really talking about is issues of racial equality around healthcare, education, and economics. So we don't want to lose sight of what this bigger issue is about. It's obviously about erasing these racially charged, these negative images of African Americans, but it's also about making real changes in this country. So I want to move on to our statutes, because Virginia Governor Ralph Northam ordered the removal of the Robert E. Lee statute, and he joined protesters and others across the US calling for the removal of Confederate statues in public spaces and parks. Now, the opposition say these statues were built in order to preserve the legacy of their ancestors that fought in the Civil War. They want to keep them to pay homage to their Southern identity. John Thomas, what do you say? Is this an important part of American history, or are these symbols of America's racist past that should be removed immediately?
First of all, the fact that Ralph Northam is still the governor after his scandal related to race is an amazing thing to me. But that aside, I don't have a problem with those monuments being put in the Smithsonian. I think that's if the community in Virginia feels that that's an important thing to do, I don't have a problem with it. I also do understand the legacy argument that it does preserve the history and the heritage of a lot of families who fought and died for not necessarily well, for their country. And so they don't want to erase their history. And I think that's what these families are concerned about. But if that means that they're going to move the history to a museum, then I'm fine with that as well.
But what about Jefferson Davis? So we saw protesters tear that Confederate statue down, Jefferson Davis. And, you know, Davis argued vehemently and often that African Americans were an inferior race fit expressly for servitude. So is there any place for Jefferson Davis in any park or public space in America?
Like I said, I think museums might be the proper place for that.
What do you think, John Murray? Should Jefferson Davis even be allowed to grace a museum given his attitude towards African Americans?
He should be in a museum. We should understand that form of hatred and that form of bigotry. You know, I live in North Virginia, like a few miles right outside of DC, and there's a highway here called Jefferson Davis Highway. And I literally open my door and spit every time I'm on that highway because I want him to know what I think of him historically. And this is what I'll say to anybody who has a problem understanding why these monuments and these statues and stuff should be taken down. You know, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was a college student at Norfolk State University where I watched the historic O.J. Simpson case take place. I remember being in the cafeteria when the verdict came in and how we all erupted in applause because Johnny Cochran had beat a justice system that had historically worked against Black people. And so for me, that was a pivotal moment in my life. Now, later I've evolved and I have a different view of O.J. Simpson. But for me, because that was a historic moment in my life and because it was history that unfolded in our country, I celebrate where I was in that time and that place in life. But if white people would be okay with having a statue of O.J. Simpson in all of their neighborhoods with the idea that he may have murdered two people that look like them, and they had to see that every day and had to acknowledge that every day because he was a great athlete and because there's a segment of the Black community that identify with him, then I'd be okay with keeping your Confederate statues up.
Let me tell you this, and I want to get your response to this, John Murray. Sophia Nelson, she's an African-American author and journalist. She wrote an opinion piece and she said she's in favor of keeping the monuments. She said a great nation doesn't hide its history, and she's not worried about 150-year-old statues of old dead white men. She says we learn when we face our history and our past. So what would you say to Sophia Nelson, who says, look, this is a lot to do about nothing. The old, statues of white men don't bother her.
Sophia Nelson is someone whose opinion and mine do not often align. And this is just one other thing that I'll dismiss to her point of view.
Very politically correctly said, John.
Like how I cleaned that up there? Okay, great.
Let me ask you, John.
There's some other people like a Roland Martin or April Ryan and so many other prolific voices that if you were giving me something that they said, I'd hold with so much more esteem. But Sophia Nelson typically has an agenda in most things that she writes and says.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, John Thomas, the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, he weighed in on this when he was taking down 3 public monuments to the Confederacy in his city. And he says they were a part of terrorism as much as a burning cross on someone's lawn and were erected to send a strong message to all who walked in their shadows about who was in charge. And basically he was saying who was in charge were white supremacists. So is there any place for these statues in any public spaces in this country, John Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I think in museums, certainly we need to learn from our history.
No public parks, no places outside, none of these big, parks where we see these statues.
I think you almost have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but you just, what I would again caution you of is like, if—
Why do you have to take it on a case-by-case basis?
Well, I'll give you—
all be moved into museums?
Well, I'll give you an example. All presidents before Abraham Lincoln, by definition, were racist, right? They allowed slavery to exist. So we should erase essentially all public references to any presidents that were president of the United States during when slavery was allowed. Is that fair? I'm not sure it is. So we just have to look. Well, is the totality of their record?
The whole roll. Some people would say absolutely that's fair. What about you, John Murray? Do you say we remove them all? We don't cherry pick.
Well, I just had an epiphany. There is a public park that some of these statues should go in. They should be in a dog park, and they should be little mini statues so that when the dogs go to relieve themselves, that those statues are the beneficiaries of that moment in time.
Well, I don't know if John Thomas would agree with you on that, but I think, John Thomas, you can't have it both ways. You say on a case by case basis, if you acknowledge that these statues are a part of our terrorist past, and they send a strong message, as the mayor of New Orleans said, about white supremacists being in charge of the streets. How can you ever advocate for these statues being in any public place?
Well, because you have to look at the public figure and what they were remembered for. Are they being remembered for their position on slavery? Or are they being remembered for their courage and other contributions to society? What are they remembered for? Not necessarily what was going on at the time of their existence, what they didn't work to stop. So you have to look at it in its totality. And that's why I think, honestly, the state itself has to look inward and examine how they feel about that statue. And if the state and the people believe that it should be put in a museum, then so be it. But I just would caution to say, let's not, and I'll use this Twitter mob mentality again, let's not just erase everybody, because then we'll get rid of all of our presidents before Abraham Lincoln. Every Democrat that was advocating for slavery, let's get rid of them. Delete them.
I don't know if we can split hairs and try to figure out what part of someone's personality, we want to necessarily lift up and what part we want to try to erase. I think we have to acknowledge that these Confederate statues that have been the subject of protests play a very negative part in our history. And as John Murray said, as we're trying to talk about and have this really uncomfortable conversation about race, and whenever we start to have it, these statues come up, and we keep getting to that place where, we're almost there in terms of acknowledging the harm that they do. And then we pull back and we start talking about the slippery slope, and we figure out ways to not move forward. And until we, push through with this uncomfortable conversation, we're going to be right back here. But I want to talk about how this is spilled over to Congress. So you probably saw, both of you are political junkies, so you saw Nancy Pelosi order portraits of Confederate speakers taken down in Congress. Now, Mitch McConnell said, okay, take the portraits down, but not the Confederate statues. John Murray, was Nancy right in removing those portraits, and should she push harder for the statues to come down as well?
I jokingly call Nancy Pelosi the man, because I say she's the toughest man in all of Capitol Hill. And to her credit, I want to acknowledge that even before this movement, a lot of the statues and Confederate images and things, she moved a lot of that stuff to the basement at her own acknowledgement early on. Once she became the speaker, and she had images of people like Rosa Parks and stuff like that moved to the forefront of the Capitol building. She's on the right side of this. History will never show Mitch McConnell favorably. He's probably one of the most wicked men to ever be in politics. And I hope the people of Kentucky really show up in a major way this upcoming election and finally send him home so he could face his racist self in the mirror, because he is an awful human being.
What do you think, John Thomas? Is Mitch McConnell on the right side of history with respect to insisting that these Confederate statues not be removed from Congress?
Well, Mitch hears from his constituents in Kentucky that obviously feel strongly about preserving their families' legacies. So that's clear. He's trying to speak on behalf of his constituents. So if that's what his constituents feel, then fine. Again, it's I just would caution us to be careful to what litmus tests we hold all of our prior leaders and public figures to, because I'm not sure most of them will withstand the test of time. So I think it's just not to say, again, that I'm against these statues being put in museums. If that's what the people feel, that's fine. But let's just be careful that cancel culture doesn't erase all of history, because when we look back 50 years from now, maybe none of us stand up to the modern standards of where race relations or current political correctness is.
Areva, John Murray, I think that's a valid point. What do you say about those historical figures that we admire in the African American community, who also may have owned slaves or may have been a part of some of this history that we are acknowledging, is so harmful to African Americans? Do we, remove their statues as well?
Yes, just before I get into that, though, I just want to point one more thing. I believe that Mitch McConnell plays to a constituency of one. We have to also remember that when America elected the first Black president, Barack Obama, Mitch McConnell said, I'm going to block everything he does. So Mitch McConnell is in the business of Mitch McConnell and Mitch McConnell alone. But I'm an equal opportunity player here in this game. If someone does something that is wrong, that is offensive, that requires being put into context, I'm all for them having to be addressed. I was one of the first Black men to go on TV that said that Bill Cosby needed to face the consequences of his bad actions in life. And I faced a lot of backlash for it. I said that about Bill Cosby before it was trendy, before Me Too was really a thing, because I understood the history and what Bill Cosby was really doing. So yes, he put a lot of people of color through college. And yes, he supported a lot of Black art and did a lot of great things, but he also drugged and raped women. And so the difference between most people of color is we don't have a problem acknowledging a thing is a thing, and we don't have a problem putting history and people in their proper context. And I think what we're asking is for the mainstream society, our white counterparts, to be able to acknowledge and do the same.
So where would you put Abraham Lincoln under that standard, John?
Murray or Thomas?
Murray.
Abraham Lincoln with a lot of these guys belong in a museum. And we don't have a problem acknowledging that they were presidents or that they were historical figures, but we need to also say that they were bad people who owned slaves who happened to be president and historical figures and did things in America.
All right, we're going to move on. Keep this hot topics going, this cancel culture.
It's hot topics too, Ariva. You got us hot.
Now, we couldn't have a conversation about cancel culture if we did not talk about Gone with the Wind. So as you know, HBO Max temporarily removed the classic film Gone with the Wind from its movie library following a number of calls to do so in light of the ongoing global protests for racial equality. Ooh, I'm going to start with you, John Thomas. Right decision or wrong to cancel Gone with the Wind?
Wrong decision. It's one thing to take down something that's in the public square, which one could argue is a place to celebrate people. It's another to essentially burn a book, right? To erase history altogether. I could understand HBO if they had Gone with the Wind featured at the very top every time you logged in, moving it off the top page and into the, available in the archives. But trying to erase that film from history is, to me, the equivalent of burning books. It's an overreaction and not necessary.
So what would you say to Ridley Scott, award-winning filmmaker who has been very vocal on this point and basically says the movie depicts some of the ethnic and racial prejudices that have been commonplace in American society, and that these racist depictions have no place in modern day film making, film viewing? What would you say to Ridley Scott?
Well, I would say that movies are art. Movies are not a reflection of morality. That I go see lots of movies. It doesn't mean that I agree with the morality that's being projected in the movie. If we have that standard, there'll be very few movies that should be produced these days. So no, you can't apply your morality to movies and say, well, if I don't like what the movie stands for, therefore the movie can't exist.
So John Murray, I would imagine that you probably disagree with John Thomas, but think about this. I'm going to ask you this. You know this movie won a slew of Oscars, including a Best Supporting Actress for Hattie McDaniel, the first African-American woman to win an Oscar. And some people, maybe don't agree with John Thomas on this, but they do agree that the movie should not have been canceled and that it does celebrate Hattie McDaniel and her accomplishments.
Well, shockingly, I actually, for the most part, agree with John Thomas on this one. And to be fair, HBO Max has not completely canceled Gone with the Wind. What they did was pulled it from the lineup because they wanted to find a way to represent it. And that's actually what I support. It is showing this movie in context. If you watch, if you go to the theater right now, well, after pandemic, but if you went to a movie theater, most movies start with a rating. If you watch television, you get a rating and a disclosure at the top of the show. What they need to do with these movies, like Gone with the Wind, is also put a disclaimer on them. I think they should come up with a rating system. I would rate this movie an I for inaccurate historic portrayal, because this movie shows slavery as a happy time, that slaves were jovial and excited to be there. And despite what Kanye West and people like Candace Owens say, slavery was not a choice. Slaves were not happy to be there. These people were beaten, tortured, and terrorized by people who owned them. And so because that is not depicted in this film, people should understand that this is somebody's art, a form of art, but not an art reflective of the reality of our times.
Well, Queen Latifah differs with you on this, John Murray. She said that, and she played Hattie McDaniels in a Netflix movie, and she had to study Hattie McDaniels' life. She got to know her, intimately, what she was about, what happened to her during this time of Gone with the Wind. And she said Hattie wasn't allowed in the theater for the Oscars, where she won Best Supporting Actress, until right before she got the award. She couldn't go in, she couldn't sit down, she couldn't join the rest of the people who were there watching the awards show, and that she was handed a speech written by the studio. She couldn't inject any of her own feelings about the movie or about the award, and that basically she was marginalized, forced to play the same kind of slave role, mammy, housekeeper maid role. And Queen Latifah says that continues to happen, the marginalization of African Americans, particularly women, in certain roles, and that this movie perpetuates that stereotype. And for her, she says the movie should be Gone with the Wind.
Yeah, I saw that Latifah says that, and I can really acknowledge why she would feel that way. I actually also watched Hollywood. Her portrayal of Hattie McDaniel was dynamic. The entire series is, because the entire series is about righting the wrongs of Hollywood through a whimsical lens. But again, I believe that these movies can exist with the proper disclaimer, with the proper packaging, that folks know what they're watching. Because yes, Hattie McDaniel is playing a slave in an inaccurate portrayal of history, but it's a performance that is a historic performance, and it should not be erased. And so as long as people can view these things through the proper lens, through the proper context, and they understand exactly what they're viewing, I think it's okay for it to still be offered for consumers.
But under that theory, John Murray, why can't we keep the logos for Uncle Ben, for Aunt Jemima, for Cream of Wheat, and have a similar disclosure, disclaimer? We can get really creative. These logo companies can make a big disclaimer on the top of that woman with a headscarf and the apron that says, this is not an actual depiction. This is not a happy slave. This is not a happy housekeeper. This is not a happy maid. So what's the difference? I don't see how you're splitting the baby here.
Well, I think a movie and a book, literature and art, is very different than commerce. A corporation packaging images set in Jim Crow South, set in slavery, set in Confederacy, and dressing it up really good on grocery store shelves for you to buy and consume, and people don't know the history or the context of that. I don't think that's the same as a movie that was created, that's a part of history, and you put a disclaimer on it. The movie analogy really actually lines up more with the statues, where we say that they should be in museums and places where people go to watch history, where I go to a movie theater or I go to a streaming platform to watch history. And this movie is a part of history. It should just actually have the historical disclaimer of its inaccuracies at the beginning of it.
But do you agree with that, John Thomas, that we can give a disclaimer for a movie, we can put a statue in a museum, but yet somehow a logo that has some of the same images is offensive and has to be completely canceled?
Yeah, I mean, it's an actually very interesting point, Erivo. I could even take that a step further. Is it fair for Netflix to financially profit off of a movie that pushed slavery? I mean, is that fair? That our corporations today should be profiting? It really, I guess, if you take it to that point, it really is no different than the Aunt Jemima bottle shape and logo. So it raises an interesting point.
But if you take it to that, if you use that analogy, then both the movie
it should
and
all
the logo
go.
would have to go.
It should all go. That's why it's
generating profit for this corporation.
The argument I suppose in art would be that the only institutions by that logic that could show it would be nonprofits, government-owned institutions. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it is an interesting if you stay true to that logic.
And so under this logic, and I don't think I agree with either of you. And as the host, that's my prerogative. In fact, I know I disagree with both of you, but I want to ask you, John Murray, are there other movies that come to mind for you that fit in this category? Because, you know, Megyn Kelly and other commentators got in on this and say, where does this end? Where does this cancel culture end? Should we remove Games of Thrones and other movies that have overly sexualized, you know, depictions of women? Should we just stop with race? Should we think about sex? Should we think about gender? So where does that end for you?
Megyn Kelly has a soft spot for cancel culture because that's the reason she's no longer perpetuating her bigotry on NBC. But listen, I believe that if there is movies and films and projects that are grossly offensive or insensitive to particular cultures or things, they need to be evaluated, and we need to find a way to package and present that art in its proper context. And maybe movies and books and other forms of art, maybe we should also consider the museum logic for those endeavors as well, because if it's not appropriate for public consumption, if there is a mass movement and not just, here's the thing, art is subjective. So somebody is going to love it. Somebody's going to hate it. Somebody's going to be comfortable with it. Somebody's going to be uncomfortable with it. You're never going to appease everybody. But the difference is when something is intentionally offensive, intentionally historically inaccurate, and all the other things that have been a part of this conversation with Gone with the Wind and so many of these other racist images that we're talking about dealing with in society.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. We'll give you the last word, John Murray. Thanks to both of you, Johns, for joining me, having this critical conversation on Juneteenth. And these are the kind of conversations we have to keep having. Sometimes we disagree, but you guys found a lot of things that you actually agree on. And I think
maybe a piece of a topic or two, Areva. And John Thomas, you were a good sport. You stood in the fire, and I really, really did appreciate the dialogue, my friend.
Likewise, it was a pleasure.
I think it just shows that we have more in common than we're given credit for. And even though we don't always agree on every fine point, that we can find common ground. And particularly on a day like Juneteenth, nothing makes me happier than to have the two Johns agreeing on something.
Happy Freedom Day. Happy Freedom Day.
Happy Freedom Day. Thanks, guys, for joining me.
Thanks.
Woo, okay. That's a way to start your Friday morning and start your Juneteenth celebration. Next, I'm going to be joined by a film critic at The Real Critic and host of WRP Radio in Chicago. His name is Reggie Ponder. And Reggie is here to help us make sense of this cancel culture and what's happening with Gone with the Wind and other movies like that. Good morning, Reggie.
Good morning. Good morning. I want to change my name to John because you had both of the Johns on. So Reggie John Ponder today.
Okay. Reggie John, just make it all the more confusing. Well, we're just all in this together. We're just having this incredible conversation about race and culture on Juneteenth. And you can't really talk about what happens with the movie Gone with the Wind or other movies like that without having a critic like yourself who, you know, your whole career, your profession is about studying movies and helping people make sense of them. So give me your take. You know, what should be happening with this movie Gone with the Wind?
So before I do that, I want to classify this into four kind of groups. Is that there's the from the Baptist tradition, I'm gonna use all these C's, right? There's the continue group that wants to really celebrate and consume without context. There's the cancel group that really wants to circumscribe consumption. This is really where the marketplace is saying, I don't want that mess, and the market will respond accordingly. Then there's the censor group who really wants to cut without conversation. And then there's the group that I fall into, which is the categorized group, where people want to consume with clarification. And I think I really believe that John Murray stated my point of view, is that when we start to clarify and to give people some context, we're good. They did not cancel. So the other John Thomas was wrong, is that they did not cancel it. They said, hey, let's put some context to it. You can still go and watch a movie. You can still go watch blackface, but do you notice that blackface movies are not big in any of these platforms? Well, there's two forces at play here. There's the consumer play that says, I don't want that stuff. There's the owner play who owns the actual entity who says, well, hey, they don't want it, man, maybe I'm not going to put it out there. But then there are places that you can go and check it out. So as long as when we talk about art, we're not talking about canceling anything. We're just talking about putting it in context. And I want to ask the question, I'd ask this to you. What's wrong with putting it in context?
Well, before I answer that, I want to comment on your blackface statement that you made, because what we have seen in terms of cancel culture are people who may have dressed in blackface 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Those images now, resurfacing, being circulated on social media, and people being quote unquote canceled or suffering severe consequences for having dressed up in blackface, even when they try to give context, like it was a Halloween party, like I was trying to make a point about, that this was bad. So I don't know if the blackface analogy really fits, because those folks who have caught hell from, putting on blackface would say, we tried to give context and nobody would listen. It was just automatic, you're canceled.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Ariva. So let me give some other context. The context is because the reason we have a problem with Going with the Wind is that there is not enough stuff out there to balance it out. This is supposed to be considered one of the best movies ever. And so because it is the classic movie, and because it stands as the ideal movie, and it's so incorrect. John Murray says, I'm gonna get back to the blackface thing in a minute. John Murray says he wants to rate it an I. I want to rate it an R. Racist. Is that whatever it is, but the context thing matters. But let's talk about blackface. Well, blackface has never been put in context. Is that because it's never been put in context, everybody's in a uproar. Is the problem with the movie industry and the problem with the way in which we're educated is that there is no balance between what we know about slavery and what's true about slavery. When we get to the point where there is enough information where people aren't scratching their head saying, oh, there's Juneteenth, I never heard of that. Oh, there's the Tulsa riots. Oh, I'd never heard about that. Oh, there's a couple of ladies who worked with Nassau and did something. I've never heard of that. When we get to that point, then you can come back and talk to me about context.
Well, we know, as you just said, the movie has not been canceled. HBO has not canceled Gone with the Wind. They took it off their platform temporarily. They're going to bring it back with an introduction from an African-American film scholar, Jacqueline Stewart. She's a professor of cinema and media at the University of Chicago, my alma mater. And Professor Stewart says she's going to give people a chance to have an informed and honest national conversation about Black lives, around this movie. But for some people, those in the camp of Queen Latifah, they ask the question, Reggie, what can we learn from this movie, even if you put a narration on top of it, even if you put an introduction on top of it? What is that going to do to help move the needle on race?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can answer what it'll do to help move the needle on race, other than to say is that when you can see what was happening during that time and what the art was during that time, that does help you define part of American history. So I'm not one to say that we erase all of American history. I like the idea of putting things in context. I like the idea of putting certain things in museums because General Lee is an important figure. We should know what Lee did, how he performed, what was his views, what he fought for. I think that that's important, as well as we should know all the other things that we're talking about. I'm just so baffled. I celebrate Juneteenth all the time. I'm baffled that people are like calling me, hey,
what's hear about Juneteenth?
What's this Juneteenth thing? So I hear Queen Latifah. I think the issue is that since the scales of justice are so in imbalance, is that people are going all the other way. And I understand it because we're mad. By the way, University of Chicago is my alma mater too. So I just want to say that so we can be, hey.
Shout out UFC. Well, see, that's a whole nother show talking about the UFC and the lack thereof of diversity and equity and inclusion.
I do want to say, so I went to undergrad at Princeton, and Princeton is dealing with this, had to deal with this issue of Woodrow Wilson. You talked to the two Johns today. So what did Princeton do? They said, man, we can't take the building down. We're not going to take the name off. But you know what we'll do? We'll put in context. We'll put a plaque out here to say, I'm not totally satisfied with that, to tell the truth, because I still got to go into the Woodrow Wilson building. But it's in context. I'm not mad and I'm not asking them to tear the building down. I just think as we look at movies like Gone with the Wind and movies like Breakfast at Tiffany's, these movies need to have some context, because Mickey Rourke's portrayal in that movie of an Asian is one of the most horrific and terrible performances ever when you look at that. So why wouldn't people say, hey, can you put it in some kind of context?
And I hear what you're saying, but the movie is really for those people that haven't seen it lately or have saw it as a kid. It's about a plantation, keeping a plantation afloat, romanticizing slavery, the affairs of Vivian Lee, the character that she played, the spoiled and self-absorbed daughter of a slave owner. And that's really, the plot line, as you will, about the movie. I guess I'm still, I don't know if I'm there yet on even the introduction. I haven't seen what the Professor Stewart is going to do with the movie. I'm sure she's brilliant. And I'm sure she's going to work some magic in terms of trying to get people to understand what was happening back then. But I guess I have to question HBO. Is this really about trying to help have a broader conversation about race, or is this about the fact that Amazon, was streaming the movie and made a fortune on the movie, and HBO lost out on that? So, should we be asking about the motivation of HBO as we think about what they're going to do as they bring the movie back?
I think so. But if you remember, I started off my conversation with my 4 categories: the continued people, the cancel people, the censor people, and the categorized people. The cancel people are really just the marketplace. Those are the people saying, I don't want it, I don't want to see it. And the marketplace will drive what places like HBO and Amazon and those places do. It's just the fact that, John Thomas talks about this mob mentality. It's not really a mob mentality when people decide to do stuff based upon the money that they have. I will not spend money for this. If you play this, this is not where my money and my attention will go. HBO has to listen to that until it impacts them in a way that they don't have to listen to it, if you understand what I'm saying.
But I think one of the questions people are grappling with, even as we talk about these statues, is, having to ask the question, the motivation, as you're talking about with regards to these movies, is why were these statues erected in the first place? And then asking the question, what is too far? And I think that's where when you talk about cancel culture, you have some that say you get on a slippery slope, so let everything go because it's art, it's, First Amendment, we shouldn't censor. But then we have this really ugly past of racism, terrorism, as the former mayor of New Orleans called it. And if we're going to really have a society that values African Americans, can they coexist? Can we really talk about equality and diversity and inclusion, but yet these statues loom so large, or movies like Gone with the Wind, loom so large in our culture?
And so my big point is, they might not loom so large when you have a library of other stuff. Is that when you have this as on some people's list, this is one of the greatest films ever, and it is in the American film as one of the top 100 films, and so on and so forth. So how many white people have come up to you during this time saying stuff like, oh, I didn't know Gone with the Wind was racist. So if you didn't know this is what we're talking about, is that people are really saying, really? Gone with the Wind was racist? You didn't know that slavery was hard? You didn't know that someone who is catering to this white women had a difficult life. You didn't know that. You thought it was something like, oh, this is a great movie. I read somewhere where some professors show this movie in their classes, and they show it, and many of the white students say, oh man, it's a great movie, because they don't think about the slavery part of it. They think about all the other stuff. But think about this. The book also had a lot of references to the KKK. And so when you don't put any of this stuff in context, it just helps to perpetuate that slavery was not as bad as it was. When somebody says to me, Areva, that they understand that Black folks didn't come over here as part of immigration, when it's not in the book, in a textbook, when somebody says to me that they understand all that kind of stuff, then I'm okay. But right now it is that there's an imbalance, and so you just can't let it stand. And I use that stand to say also the statues, you can't let them stand, because that means when I walk past that statue every day, I heard John Murray say that he spits at the road that's named after someone. Is that, but when I go past that every day, I get this feeling like my life doesn't matter. Are you serious that we're celebrating this person? So I don't want to celebrate Gone with the Wind without it having some kind of context that this is inaccurate, it's not true, and slavery was a cruel and very hard thing.
But if you have those feelings and those passionate feelings that you just expressed, Reggie, which are the passionate feelings of many, I would say, and probably the majority of particularly people in the African American community, then why not, say bye to Gone with the Wind the way Queen Latifah says? Because more than just the images that we saw in the movie, it is the treatment that Hattie McDaniel suffered.
Wow.
So although we celebrate her being the first African-American woman to win an Oscar, we also know, based on Queen's history, lesson deep dive that she had to do to play her, how she was treated and how she was marginalized and minimized in Hollywood, and how, as she even went to accept that award, she was being oppressed. Even in the process of being celebrated, she was being oppressed. So why not just say, boy, bye to Gone with the Wind?
Oh, okay, Areva, bye. I'm gone. No, I really understand that. I'm just saying I don't fall there, but I really, really understand people saying, bye, Felicia. I would just want to make the argument, which I've been trying to, but maybe not as good as I should be, is that I just would want to make the argument to them that means that you don't have full context of our history. I think it's okay to have full context of our history, to know that Woodrow Wilson was against Black people and was against slavery. Erase him off the face of the earth, and then all of a sudden we don't understand his role in segregation and bigotry and racism.
But we can study the history of Woodrow Wilson without erecting monuments to him that celebrate him. So there are lots of people who we study from a historical perspective who don't have large statues, erected, or monuments or buildings or plazas or streets or airports. So, they're not mutually exclusive. But let me ask you this before I let you go, Reggie. What if Ava or Spike or someone like that was commissioned by HBO or some big studio to redo Gone with the Wind, to remake it, and to tell the story of that time? So we don't have to have Professor Stewart, don't want to, make her lose a job. But, we don't have to have that kind of introduction to the movie, but we really get to see the movie made from the lenses of African-American filmmakers.
I've been wanting that for every white movie ever, is that when we show a movie like The Butler and movies like that, can it come solely the help? Can it come solely from the Black person's perspective? Can we just give that perspective as well? So I've been wanting that. I'd love that. I think that really goes into my argument of saying is that because without balance, I need context. And all you just did was say, hey, let me give you some context by showing it on the other side. Either way, I'm just asking for context.
I said do away with it and remake it. So let's be clear that I did say bye Felicia to the movie. And I did say let Ava, let Spike, let someone else remake this movie and give it, you call it context. I say give it a fresh look and give it a realistic portrayal of what was happening during that time. But I do agree with you that one of the biggest issues we're seeing here is we just don't have enough movies. We don't have enough art. We don't have enough films. We don't have enough, historical statutes to balance. And so when we get these portrayals, and someone on a young woman on my production team said that it was required viewing in her high school class, Gone with the Wind, and she went to a predominantly white school with predominantly white teachers. So, I didn't get a chance to find out from her what context was given to that movie at that time, but I know many of us saw the movie without any context. And we did think that, oh, these Black people were so happy living in this big house.
Yeah, for
big plantation
sure.
Was quite lovely, and this must have been a really wonderful time to be alive in America.
So Areva, I just want to say before I go though, is that I would not be in favor of Spike Lee or Ava making the movie and getting rid of the other one. I wouldn't be in favor of that. I let that movie stay. It's a piece of art. They've done it. Now I got some real context. Okay, look at this other side of what it is. So that's it. And I'm just so saddened that people are just learning a little bit about Black history when it just is whitewashed in everything that we do in our movies and our school books and all of that. So I'm just would like for us to have more context and more art that reflects the other perspective, the other part of the truth. This one is not true, but the truth about slavery and injustice.
Well said, Reggie. And this is an interesting morning where I disagree with all of my guests, but that's okay. That just goes to show that there is lots of opinions and people can have a lot in common, but can differ on these really complex issues. But thank you so much, Reggie, for sharing your voice, for being out there, being a critic on these important films. I know you got to get to your own radio show. So again, I so appreciate you joining me this morning. And we're going to look for that Ava and Spike redo of Gone with the Wind.
Love it. Love that. Thank you so much. You have a great weekend. Happy Juneteenth.
All right. Happy Juneteenth to you as well. Wow. This has been a fun morning. We've had some really interesting topics, even though we've been talking about these hard issues of race. We have found ways to agree and to disagree. Again, I want to thank my three guests for coming on. Tremendous thanks to my sponsor, Special Needs Network, for allowing us to have these critical conversations at such an important moment in our history, and particularly this conversation on Juneteenth. Big shout out to my production team. So before I let you go, I always have to leave you with my words to live by. So, oh my God, this has been a whirlwind week. The two officers involved in the shooting death of Rayshard Brooks were charged, one with 11 counts, including felony murder and aggravated assault for kicking Mr. Brooks while he lay dying on the parking lot of Wendy's. The other officer charged with 3 counts, including aggravated assault for standing on Mr. Brooks' chest and shoulder. Just gives me chills even thinking about what happened to that 28-year-old father of 4 as he lay on that parking lot of Wendy's. But those 2 officers involved have been charged. Also this week, we saw Trump sign an executive order on policing. The GOP unveiled its Police Reform Act, and Congress, the Democratic Congress, held hearings on its reform bill. And to top it all off, a state representative in California introduced a bill to revive affirmative action and to consider slavery reparations in the state of California. All of this activity would lead one to conclude that there is a seismic shift occurring in this country as it relates to the nation's attitudes regarding people of color. But I say, not so fast. I agree with my Harvard Law School colleague, Brian Stevenson, who eloquently stated, we have never honestly addressed all the damage that was done during the 2.5 centuries that we enslaved Black people. The great evil of slavery wasn't the servitude, it was the fiction that Black people aren't good as white people and aren't the equals of white, that we are less, that we're less evolved, less capable, less worthy, and less deserving of white people. Now, you can't argue that it's time for America to reckon with its ugly past while also arguing that cancel culture has gone too far and that we shouldn't get hung up on a company logo or an old white statue or even a movie that romanticizes slavery. To ignore these powerful cultural symbols is to deny what they represent. And for me, we can't say Black people are equal and are deserving to be treated as equals in the workplace and by law enforcement when we constantly bombard police with images of Black people that reinforce the notion that they are less than. There is such a thing as the slippery slope. We learn about it in the first year of law school. And to Megyn Kelly or anyone who wonders if cancel culture has gone too far on these issues of race, I say in the famous words of Vivian Lee, I don't give a damn. Some slippery slopes are worth sliding down. And as it relates to Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, Jefferson Davis, Gone with the Wind, Robert E. Lee, it's time for them all to go. We can't heal or chart a path forward if we are constantly being reminded that we are subhuman. It's time to eat the whole roll and say goodbye to those symbols that tear African Americans down rather than lift us up. See, we ain't asking for charity, but we are demanding parity. Have a great Juneteenth and a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday. We are continuing our conversation on race and culture. We are talking about what it means to have a diverse workforce, and is diversity an illusion for many of the companies that say they stand with the protesters, they stand with Black Lives Matter. We're going to talk to some experts about what that really means. So I'll see you back here Monday morning at 9 a.m. And remember, we are all in this together.